So let's just get right to it. Have scientists ever found real, hard proof of psychic powers? It's a question that has fascinated people for, well, over 100 years. We're going to dive into the very rigorous and honestly, often very strange scientific journey to find an answer.
You know, things like telepathy, seeing the future, moving objects with your mind, these are the kinds of abilities that have fueled so many stories and this deep, deep hope that maybe we're more than what we seem. But what happens when you take these incredible claims and put them under the cold, hard microscope of science?
So there's actually a formal name for this whole field of study. It's called parapsychology. And just to be clear, it's not really about ghost hunting or UFOs. It's a very specific and, let's be honest, very controversial branch that tries to use the scientific method to investigate these alleged psychic phenomena.
To even begin to study this in a lab, researchers needed a neutral term. You can't just write magic in your research paper, right? So they came up with psi, using the Greek letter for mind or soul. You can think of psi as the X factor, that mysterious unknown force they were trying to pin down and prove actually exists.
And you know, this whole quest for proof, it didn't just start last week. It has a really long and fascinating history, absolutely full of brilliant minds, some incredibly bold claims, and, as you can imagine, some seriously intense debate.
This timeline gives you a pretty good idea of the key moments. It all kicked off way back in the late 1800s with a bunch of scholars in London. Then, fast forward to the 1930s, and the whole operation moves into a serious university lab in America, really trying to make it a hard science. And then, by the 70s, things got really interesting when the US government got involved, hoping they could turn psi into some kind of secret weapon.
Okay, so this guy, J.B. Ryan at Duke University, his work was a huge shift in how this was all done. He wanted to get away from spooky stories and into a controlled laboratory. And his weapon of choice? A simple deck of cards with 5 symbols on them. His goal was to find people who could guess the cards way more accurately than random chance would ever allow.
The math here is actually pretty simple. With 5 symbols, you have a 1 in 5 shot of getting it right, which is 20%. But Ryan wasn't looking for a lucky guess here and there. He was searching for a consistent, statistically meaningful signal, something that stood out from the noise of random guessing. And to find it, he ran literally hundreds of thousands of trials.
So how in the world do you even begin to design an experiment to test for something as slippery as telepathy? Well, it turns out researchers came up with some pretty clever setups.
The Ganzfeld experiment is probably the most famous modern attempt to test for telepathy. The whole idea is to create this state of mild sensory deprivation. That's why you have the white noise and, yes, literally halved ping-pong balls over the eyes. The theory goes that if you can quiet down the noise from our regular senses, maybe, just maybe, that faint signal of psi can finally come through. It's almost like trying to tune a mental radio to some kind of psychic broadcast.
And then there was remote viewing. This is the one that really captured the imagination of the intelligence agencies. I mean, could a person, just sitting in a quiet room, accurately describe a secret military base on the other side of the planet? That was the big question behind the government's multi-million-dollar Stargate project.
So for a while there, the results coming out of these labs seemed, well, pretty promising, even a little startling. But then the critiques started rolling in. And this is really where the whole thing begins to fracture, and the evidence starts to show some serious cracks.
And here it is. This is the single biggest problem in the entire history of parapsychology, the replication crisis. In science, if an experiment can't be repeated by other independent scientists in other labs, the results just aren't considered reliable. It's a cornerstone of the whole scientific method. And for psi, this has been a persistent and pretty much fatal flaw.
This chart basically says it all, doesn't it? On the one hand, you have Ryan reporting these subjects who are scoring way above that 20% chance level. But then, when other labs tried to replicate his exact methods, the results just kept falling right back down to random chance. The effect? It just disappeared. And sometimes, the explanation was a lot worse than just a statistical blip. I mean, listen to this. This is a jaw-dropping confession from Douglas Blackburn, who was one of the star subjects from the early days, basically admitting that his famous telepathy act was a total hoax, and that he designed it specifically to fool the researchers who so badly wanted to believe.
So skeptics started putting together this long list of problems. You had sensory leakage, things like subjects being able to see faint outlines on the back of cards. A huge one is the file drawer problem. That's the idea that researchers only publish their successful studies, while all the failed ones get stuffed in a file drawer, which gives us really misleading impression that the effect is real.
And on top of all the honest mistakes and flaws, yeah, there were multiple cases of researchers being caught red-handed faking their data. So, after more than 20 years and millions of taxpayer dollars, what was the final verdict on the government's Stargate project? Well, the official report from 1995 was brutal. It said remote viewing never provided useful intelligence. The data was mostly garbage, and the project was shut down. The search for a psychic spy was a total bust.
Okay, so after all of this, a century of searching, all these experiments, all these debates, where does the scientific community actually stand today on whether psi exists?
At the end of the day, the verdict is pretty clear and pretty overwhelming. The consensus view in the scientific community is that there is simply no solid, credible, repeatable evidence to support the existence of psychic phenomena. And because of that, along with all the persistent problems, the field is widely considered a pseudoscience. And this brings us to a really important distinction. You have parapsychology, which starts with the assumption that psi is real and its job is to find it. But then you have this other field, anomalistic psychology. It starts from the opposite assumption, that psi is not real and its job is to try and explain why people have these powerful, seemingly paranormal experiences using what we already know about the human brain, about perception, and about our own cognitive biases.
And really, if you want the final authoritative word on the subject, it doesn't get much clearer than this quote from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. They reviewed 130 years of research and concluded there is just no scientific justification for any of it.
Which leaves us with a final and maybe even more profound question. After a century of failed experiments, debunked claims, and harsh critiques, our fascination with psychic powers is as strong as it's ever been. So why? Why do we still want to believe in a world beyond what our senses can show us, even when there's so much evidence telling us it isn't there? That might just be the greatest mystery of all.